Welcome back to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. On this week's episode, we have a guest host, so please be the same respectful audience you are for me and enjoy.
This episode's brought to you by Heidi. Imagine kicking back while a HIPAA-compliant AI scribe writes your soap notes for free. Yes, you heard us right, Heidi is free. I'm Dr. Tom, Heidi's CEO and founder, and we started Heidi to stop clinicians wasting their life on clinical documentation. Heidi transforms your consult babble into crisp, clear soap notes, personalizing itself with every edit. One day, Heidi will be your AI resident, looking through research, explaining plans, and doing anything you don't want to. If you currently pay for an AI scribe in your practice, you should swap to Heidi. We'll even credit you for anything you've already paid. Dive into the description for the link and make your practice the envy of every stethoscope in town. Sign up and watch Heidi work its magic, all for free, because you've got better things to do.
Hi there, I'm John Schneider. I'm the guest host today on Behavioral Guide to Doctoring podcast, and I have the pleasure of talking with Amanda Ripley, an old friend, who is the author of High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. Looking forward to a wonderful discussion about conflict and how we can mitigate it.
Hey, this is Brad Block, host of the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle.
All right. Well, once again, I want to welcome Amanda Ripley, award-winning journalist and author of one of the, I would say, top 3 books I've ever read in my life, High Conflict. And welcome back, and it's great to reconnect with you.
Oh, well, that's so kind of you, John. It's good to be back with you. How are you?
I'm good. So, conflict. I focus on this in lectures I give and how I train my residents and conversations with other doctors, because conflict is ever present in the healthcare space. It is any space, as you will teach us today, with interpersonal relationships is going to have some degree of conflict. And in medicine in particular, and we'll get to this hopefully later, the conflict in medicine, I think, has been growing. And I think the pandemic had a lot to do with that. We'll get to that later. But to really jump in, I want to highlight the book High Conflict, which is your latest book. And it really set me on a road of understanding conflict in a much better way. So I want to start with this concept of good versus high conflict, because I think that our listeners, we need a framework for understanding conflict, and that's what I think the book gives us.
Okay, so I think for me, the big lesson is that it's not about, the problem isn't conflict, right? I mean, we know that we need conflict as humans to get stronger, to get smarter. We need to be pushed. Sometimes we need to push. That is actually the fastest shortcut to transformation, is conflict. It's an incredible tool. And you can't, just like in a marriage, you can't sort of thrive without conflict. That's true in a democracy. It's true, I'm assuming, in a hospital. It's true in an operating room. So the kind of conflict you're in turns out to be really important, which was hugely helpful for me to understand. So I spent a few years following people who work in really intense conflict of all kinds, gang violence, domestic violence, high conflict divorces, civil war, terrorism, all kinds of really intense situations between humans. And the most important lesson they taught me was that the kind of conflict you're in really matters. And good conflict is the kind of conflict where questions get asked. You occasionally feel flashes of curiosity or surprise in between anger and frustration or sadness, which are all good and fine, important signals, right? But you come out of a good conflict encounter, it might be uncomfortable, right? It's not like fun necessarily, but you come out the other side better for it in some way. You understand either yourself, the other person, or the problem a little better. By contrast, right, high conflict, which is sometimes called in the research intractable conflict or malignant conflict, that's the kind of conflict that takes on a life of its own. So it escalates to a point where it becomes conflict for conflict's sake. And eventually you start to harm the thing you went into the fight to protect. whether it's your kids in a divorce or your country in high conflict politics, right? And you usually don't even know it, but you start to actually mimic the behavior of your enemy in a way that's really diabolical. So high conflict is the thing that's much more likely to lead to suffering for everyone to different degrees and to violence. So that's the kind of thing we want to avoid, if that makes sense.
It does. I want to hone in on actually that one particular aspect of where you start to mimic, as you say, you start to mimic the behavior of your opponent, for lack of a better word. And if I'm hearing this correctly, it has to do with kind of you lose that constructive work that you're losing that progress as a result. Tell me a little bit more about that. I think that's really helpful for us to understand.
Yeah, I think there's a point at which the stress level and emotion is useful, right? It kind of gets your attention. And then there's a point at which it starts to be counterproductive. And this is true. My first book was about human behavior in disasters. And so it was true in, physical danger as much as it's true in mental danger, right? Like your brain reacts in a similar way to some degree. So a certain amount of stress is useful. But then past a certain point, if you're perceiving the other person or the other side as a real threat, whether you should or not, if you're perceiving that threat at a certain level, you start to lose eye-hand coordination. You literally lose your peripheral vision. A bunch of things happen that are not helpful to you in a kind of modern day conflict. And one of the things that happens is you stop asking questions and you stop experiencing curiosity or surprise. You become pretty closed off to opportunity, which is why it's such a problem, right? Because then even when there are opportunities, not necessarily to resolve the conflict, but maybe, right? But also just to get things done, you can't get them done. And we see this in Congress, right, at scale, where there is broad agreement among the American public on certain things and even among members of Congress, but they cannot function on major problems facing the country because the high conflict takes over. Right. And it becomes too threatening, or it feels too threatening to give the other side any kind of space.
One of the big things that I took away from your book is the false binaries and as I'm listening to you, I want to explore this a little because I think that when you're in that high conflict with someone or between groups, and I'm just going to say this to our readers, like a lot of physicians feel in this conflict with the administrative state in healthcare, right? That there's this kind of tension between the caregivers and the administrative, folks in medicine or the administrative state in medicine. And there's it's actually complex. The system is very complex. Yet when we get together and we talk and we begin to vent and our frustrations come out, and I hear this from my colleagues, there is sometimes a reductionism, maybe an oversimplification into very kind of binary states and binary items of conflict.
So like, for example, would it be the administration of the hospital versus the nurses or the physicians, or is that the kind of thing you mean?
Yeah. And so you see this not infrequently where there's the perceived opposition just within one hospital is you have all these groups that are feeling, opposed to each other for various reasons. And I wonder, as probably many of our listeners do, why it's so hard to get change to happen in healthcare. And I wonder whether it comes from what you just said, which is when you're stuck, and Congress being an example, when you're stuck focusing on the conflict and not maintaining it, but just kind of caught in it, as you say in the book, you're done. There's no progress after that.
Right, because you can't give the other side the benefit of the doubt ever, right? Or it feels that way.
And this idea of false binaries, I think, is really compelling because we do, as you said, we get tunnel vision, right? We lose that peripheral vision. We lose our curiosity. And I think cognitively, we end up then becoming reductionist in a way that I suppose, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, just be able to think about the issues, albeit in a state where our cognition is probably not at its best level because of all the emotion and because of all the threat. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. There's 4 tripwires that tend to lead to high conflict, the really dangerous, dysfunctional kind of conflict. And one of them is false binaries. So sort of splitting the world into categories that are very neat and tidy, usually not really that accurate. And I think that's what I hear you describing. So this would be, other examples would be Democrats versus Republicans, blacks versus whites, right? There's always this tendency in difficult conflict to split, which is actually, I just did a column not too long ago for the Washington Post about this. Like there's a term in psychology called splitting, which is where we literally divide the world into good and evil. And what's interesting to me is about why and when we do it, right? We don't always fall prey to this, but there's certain times when we're more likely to. And again, it makes us make mistakes, which is the biggest problem with it. It's very energizing, right? To know for sure this kind of clean line, right, between you and them, between us and them. But you make a lot of mistakes and like own goals, in other words, from soccer, right? I don't know if you like soccer, but that's something I think about a lot is all the own goals we're making on ourselves when you score on yourself. So some of the ways that the times that I learned from talking to psychologists and people who study splitting, we tend to do it when we're feeling anxious and there's a lot of uncertainty. So you see it a lot among people who have like borderline personality disorder or who are very depressed. But now you see it in a lot of people who maybe wouldn't be diagnosed that way, because the more anxious and afraid we feel, the more we need that certainty. And then we become really vulnerable to one of the other high conflict pre-existing conditions, which is the presence of conflict entrepreneurs. So people or companies that really exploit our desire for certainty and clarity. And they help us frame these false binaries, to frame the us versus them. And they keep reminding us and giving us new reasons to lump people together. It's very seductive, right? I've definitely caught myself doing it. Generalize about 75 million people who voted a certain way in an election, which is like, I would never do that about another country. Like I would never take a country of 75 million people and tell you that I could read into the hearts and souls of those people. But I do it all the time in conflict. So it's just something to be conscious of and to notice when other people do it.
Well, I think actually in medicine, we can fall victim to that ourselves. Medicine is wrought with uncertainty. It just is, because we don't know everything and we don't know what's going to be the next discovery, that'll happen in a year or 10 years that'll help our patients.
But people look to you for certainty.
Absolutely. And so there's this constant tension between uncertainty and certainty. And that translates to lots of aspects of healthcare, just like any organization, in the sense of Congress recently, for example, Congress has, and this has been going on for a couple of years, but Congress has been trying to reduce Medicare payments to physicians because of this kind of formula that is debatably, old and antiquated. And the money factor in medicine, which is a whole nother topic, greatly affects the certainty of physicians and hospitals and anybody who's providing care to understand whether they can continue to do that. And so there's visceral reaction that you see amongst like our professional organizations, like academies of whatever specialty it is, that really fight against this because of, albeit really truthful, worry about the ability to provide care. But nonetheless, you see the opportunity for conflict entrepreneurs to come in and exploit that, because people are emotional, they're worried, the future is uncertain. It can be very challenging. It also makes me think, and I do want to come back to this later, but even in the doctor-patient relationship, there is a potential, and this gets into the ethics of medicine, there is a potential for medical gaslighting and kind of people to hone in on that fear, that desire for uncertainty or fear of uncertainty, and take advantage of it and create certainty where there may not be certainty. It's not the same as politics necessarily, but it can lead to conflict. especially when the outcome doesn't match what your expectations are for a given treatment or for a given care intervention.
Absolutely. Right. Like there's tension you identified, craving for certainty when there isn't any. I remember when my mom was sick with ovarian cancer, and at some point a surgeon gave my dad some percentage odds of something. And my dad is like a numbers guy, right? Who was frightened. And so he would never talk about his fear, but he held on to that number for dear life, right? And of course, that's not how it worked out. And she did die pretty quickly. And so there was this like fixation on the number. And luckily he let it go, but you could see how that craving for certainty might, pressure a doctor into giving a number, and then that becomes something that can come back around, right? Because we don't know.
And obviously, I'm not suggesting that there are a ton of doctors out there, being conflict entrepreneurs. But it does bring up for all of us who are in the physician role that the care with which we need to, approach our relationships with our patients in such a way that we don't bring that relationship closer to a high conflict situation. Right? That we recognize what takes us into high conflict and be able to then navigate that in such a way that we can communicate with our patients in a very ethical and patient-centered way, so that we can all be on the same page about what may come. And I want to come back. You said there's 4 kind of tripwires, and we've talked about the false binaries, and we've talked about the conflict entrepreneurs. What are the other 2 that we get into?
So the other 2 are corruption, like when you can't trust institutions to do what they're supposed to do. And that's certainly part of the high conflict in politics and medicine, I would assume. So, and it can be perceived or real corruption, right? It sort of doesn't matter on the ground, because they both lead people to go around institutions, around the referees, and to look for certainty in places where, are maybe they shouldn't, right? Or maybe not trustworthy, but it leaves us all very vulnerable when there's corruption, right? So corruption, false binary, conflict entrepreneurs, and then also humiliation, which is probably the most interesting and underappreciated force that's driving every high conflict I've ever seen, from war to school board feuds to neighborhood battles. I mean, you name it. And it's really important to be alert to this one, because sometimes we humiliate people without even meaning to, right? Sometimes we do it on purpose, right? Certainly social media and other things, the news media, there are certain institutions we've really designed to humiliate at scale, which is a problem. And also sometimes we do it without realizing it. And so I was talking to a politician the other day, and she was telling me how someone across the aisle was behaving in a way that just didn't make logical sense. Like there was something that they wanted to get done, and it was in both of their interests, both of their parties' interests. And the other person was just obstinate, just refusing to budge. And she thought to herself, I wonder if humiliation is at play here. And she couldn't think of why this other person would feel humiliated, which is, I imagine this will feel familiar to you, which is why we have to listen to people. We have to talk to people. We can't get in their heads, especially if there's a divide between us or a power dynamic between us. So she asked this other politician to go to lunch. And they started talking about it, and she was really listening and trying to paraphrase back and check for understanding and all the things. And she figured out, this woman felt disrespected, this other politician, because she'd been left out of something that she felt like she should have been included in. And we could argue all day about whether she was right or wrong, but it sort of doesn't matter. And so the politician I was talking to just apologized. She just apologized for that. As William Ury, the negotiator, said to me recently, the cheapest concession you could make in a negotiation is respect. It costs you nothing, even though it might feel like it costs you a lot. But the other person's dignity might not mean much to you, but it means a lot to them. And so that's what she did. And then they were able to close the deal and get it done that day. So often humiliation is lurking underneath, and that's one to kind of keep an eye out for. I don't know. How does that resonate in your world, John?
Well, I had it written down because I think that it's not something that we talk about a lot in medicine. We talk about respect. We talk about the ethics of autonomy of the patient. in terms of the virtue ethics of medicine, in terms of, how do we respect patients? How do we respect our colleagues? So we have narratives around this, but I think that many of us experience exactly what you said, which is that there are moments as a patient, as a family member of a patient, as a physician, that humiliation piece creeps in. And it probably isn't direct, deriding and, name calling and kind of, adolescent kind of stuff. But it can be very subtle. I think, with patients, it is something that we all kind of have struggled with. I think many of the listeners would feel this, and I've struggled with this, in that there's a fine line between a disagreement with someone and humiliation. When you tell somebody that that they're not correct in some way. And in medicine, it can be tricky, I think, to do that well, because belief, especially about something that is uncertain, as we talked about earlier, belief can be the anchor or the support on which you are kind of, dealing with the uncertainty of your health.
Right. So if someone challenges your core belief, especially if there's an audience for that. So humiliation is really destabilizing when there's other people watching. Yeah, I could see that would really.
Well, and this is, to give the listeners just an obvious example, was mask mandates, right? Like, this is, as you say, at scale. Lots of things around COVID were, there was humiliation mixed in with this. Are you vaccinated?
Yeah, and there was false binaries, right? And there was corruption, and there were conflict entrepreneurs, all the things, ding, ding, because you were either vaccinated or not. I mean, unfortunately, there were some those aren't even false. Like, those are actual binaries, But in fact, there's lots of nuance in both of those groups. Like, there's different reasons why people got vaccinated or didn't, right? But it feels very binary.
And in the umbrella of really scary uncertainty, are we going to die from this, pandemic? You saw it come through in every way you just described, that people felt humiliated if they were on both sides of these debates, masks, vaccines, medicines, whatever it may be. And like, I'm an ear, nose, and throat doctor, right? I do, complex surgeries and whatnot, and I didn't have a ton of stake in the game in terms of COVID, other than making sure my patients were protected, making sure my staff was protected, and my family. But even in our clinics, those tough conversations came in about masking, about vaccines, about things. And the physicians I talked to were just wrestling with this idea of, like, how can I have a conversation around this when everybody is so wound up? Because the minute it's like nobody wanted to dip their toe in the water for fear that they would fall into the conflict pool around these issues.
Yeah, right. No, it was wild. Like, looking back on it, it's no wonder that everybody's kind of traumatized, especially in your profession. I mean, it's just,
right.
It was all the things, we've just listed them all happening at once, and a deep craving for certainty, right? Going back to that initial tension we talked about. And then the humiliation piece. I mean, I remember going running outside one day in DC during the early part of the pandemic. And this elderly lady yelled at me because I'd pulled my mask down while I was running outside, right? And I was so angry, right? Because I felt humiliated. I felt like, I'm just trying to get some peace. I'm just trying to get some exercise. And I'm outside. I'm nowhere near you. And I didn't do anything. I just pulled the mask up, kept running. But there were like 10 of those a day, right? On all sides. And then I would get home and be really angry at my husband if he didn't wear a mask to like an event or something, right? And so I would go in all directions. It was not consistent, but it was just a really difficult time.
I'm imagining all the listeners just like vigorously nodding like this because they're just completely, we all lived it. And it is a very salient example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's my favorite quote about humiliation is from Nelson Mandela, who says, "There's nobody more dangerous than one who's been humiliated, even when you humiliate him rightly." So, the lesson from all of this is try not to humiliate people, right? Try not to publicly embarrass them if you can avoid it. And also, pay attention when leaders frame everything as a humiliation. Because that's usually a conflict entrepreneur, right? If you listen to Putin's speech before the invasion of Ukraine, for example, it's just laced through with allegations of humiliation. Same was true in Germany before World War II, right? So this is an old trick and something to just be aware of because we are really vulnerable to it at times of uncertainty and fear.
Are you looking to diversify your investment portfolio and maximize your returns? By learning short-term investing skills, you can yield higher returns at compressed speeds by creating income on a daily and weekly basis. Today's sponsor, Lightspeed Investing, has amassed over a decade's worth of success and experience in this field to teach you how to leverage the futures and commodity financial markets. Inspired by the billionaire natural gas trader John Arnold, Lightspeed Investing has built a proprietary training and educational platform. For more information, connect with President and CEO Philip J. Hawk Chan on LinkedIn, or you can start your journey towards financial freedom and abundance at Lightspeed rates, like many medical professionals already have.
I mean, in medicine, we talk a lot about leadership, especially among physicians. There's a lot of leadership training. There's a lot of, leadership institutes and so on and so forth. And it's really become this incredibly big business. But I don't hear often that point of how, as leaders, whether that is at an institutional level of a hospital, whether that's in your own practice, whatever, how you train yourself to, and I don't know, I'm asking you do we train ourselves to listen for when we are coming close to dangerously close to humiliating somebody? Because I think it's subtle, as we said. It's not something like people can, and you may not even intend it.
Right, for sure. Most of the time, that's...
Right. And yet, we don't always recognize when it's happened.
Right. And I mean, that's where relationships are so important, right? Or rapport. If you don't have time for a relationship, then, in a crisis situation, right? Rapport is so important because you need to be able to figure out what's going on because I can't predict what's going to humiliate you and vice versa. We would probably be humiliated by different things. It's just really hard to know. During World War II, guards in concentration camps would order prisoners to make and remake their beds over and over until they were perfect, right? And Holocaust survivors told the psychologist Nico Frieda about this years ago. But interestingly, it was the male survivors who said they felt humiliated by this experience. And the female survivors did not feel humiliated. They felt annoyed, right? They felt, angry, but they interpreted it slightly differently. It was just like another indignity among many. Either way, they were being harassed. But whether it was humiliating depended on the person's identity and sort of core beliefs about the world and what it means to matter or not matter. So, that's why we need to be able to listen to each other and to ask questions and to have enough rapport to figure out if the person did feel humiliated, even if they shouldn't.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I teach our students and our residents about communication in healthcare. And I think that is one thing that is I'll be honest, very hard to teach because it's hard to teach someone how to listen carefully enough to the reaction, even when you didn't intend it. I mean, obviously in concentration camps, it was intended. And certainly there are moments in organizational leadership and, even interprofessional communication where conflict entrepreneurs can take over. But for most of us, I think it is true that we don't even necessarily know when it's happened.
For sure, especially in your profession. I mean, I feel like, I just got a routine diagnostic thing done yesterday, and just putting on the gown can feel, you feel really exposed. I mean, there's things that no one intends. It's just the nature of the situation can lead to feelings of humiliation and vulnerability that if you work in that profession, you don't even notice probably. I mean, you don't even think about that, right? So one of the fixes for many of these problems, right, is to switch roles. And sometimes this is hard to do, but anytime I'm imagining that you are a patient, right, you suddenly remember what it's like to put a hospital gown on or to sit in a waiting room for 45 minutes, or all the small indignities that are part of the experience, intentional or not. So, some organizations. So a lot of these things, the fundamental lesson is this, like if people remember nothing else, it's this: in high conflict times, which is what we are in, any intuitive thing you do to try to get out of the conflict is going to make it worse. So you have to do counterintuitive things, which is really hard and requires practice in a low stakes setting in advance, right? Which is why it's so important that you work with your students on communicating when they're not stressed out or feeling threatened or angry or rushed, right? So I ended up starting an organization after the book came out called Good Conflict with my co-founder, Helene Bianduti-Hofer, where we just operationalize all this stuff, because what we found is we can't do it under stress. Like, we have to practice it. So we have to practice asking different questions. We have like 15 questions that we ask people in conflict. We have a looping technique for listening that we practice, which is actually a lot of fun to practice, believe it or not. And I'm sure you do similar things with your students, but it's like these things you have to have like muscle memory for them, so that when you're under stress, you can do them automatically, right? Without even thinking, and then de-escalate, reframe, rebuild trust, figure out what's really going on, and so that you can get things done, right? Without making more mistakes.
Well, first, it sounds like I should come take a course with you.
We would love to have you, John. We would love to have you as a teacher as well.
But that hits home so much, especially the part about, walking in someone else's shoes and being appreciative of their experience. It is, our attention span, as intelligent as, most physicians, as, highly educated physicians and nurses, and, we've gone through rigorous training, all of the people in healthcare have, dedicated their lives to this. But in the moment, you have limited attention. And the more complex the situation gets, the more stressful the situation gets, we all have to recognize that we are at risk of saying the wrong thing, becoming a conflict entrepreneur, albeit not at the level of the dictators that we think of, right? But bringing the situation into high conflict when we didn't intend to. Sometimes, I imagine, and the question for you is, sometimes we can't prevent that sometimes we just trip and fall into those scenarios. Yet, what I'm hearing from you is there's a moment where you can still step back from it, but you have to be intentional. And you have to say, I recognize that we're in high conflict. Let me step back. Let me reframe.
Yeah. And that, I don't know any other way to do that except to practice it outside of the situation. It's really good to practice if you have kids at home, because kids are constantly bringing you conflict, right? Or creating conflict. So there's lots of lower stakes places to practice it. But William Ury, who I mentioned earlier, who's a negotiator, who's worked in, Colombia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, you name it, all the highest conflict places in the past 47 years. He's worked behind the scenes to try to reduce the violence. And he calls it going to the balcony. So basically, to your point, John, the first fight is with yourself, figuring out, am I, what is going on? what am I feeling, right? And it sounds so squishy. I hate that because that's not who I am, but it is true. And you have to kind of notice that and have a few things that you just automatically do. He calls it going to the balcony, where you pretend you're kind of watching this from above and you remember, you take a deep breath, you remember, like, what is my goal here? Like, is my goal to win? Probably not in most situations, right? And so kind of having some kind of ritual. He talked about getting screamed at for 30 minutes by the Venezuelan leader, Hugo Chavez, at some point in front of his entire cabinet and other things. And he would like pinch his hand, the palm of his hand, to kind of pull his attention and go to the balcony in his mind so that he could remember what he actually wanted out of this situation. And so he just didn't react, which can be the most powerful tool we've got in a lot of conflicts, and let Chavez just kind of wear himself out. And then at that point he could listen, but not until then.
It's fascinating. It is. I don't know that we're taught to do that very well as humans, number one, but in medicine, when I refer to or teach a lot of our trainees that one of the traps we fall into is the task blindness, that we just completely get overwhelmed with the tasks in medicine. And as a result, we then lose the ability to get to that metacognitive state, to get to that balcony and see what's happening in front of us.
It's kind of like a pilot, right? Like you've got a lot of data and tools and instruments and people and things that you're managing. It's like only so much bandwidth. Is that what you mean? Yeah,
exactly. And it's hard because all of that stuff is critical. I mean, we have been in the airline metaphor, the flying a plane metaphor has been in medicine for decades, because for safety, patient safety and quality, it's extremely important. Yet, in our focus on that, we can sometimes forget to have that balcony view. And that's maybe when we get into the conflict that we would rather not be in. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a hard situation. I mean, I don't know about healthcare practitioners, but for journalists, the world I come from, we weren't trained in any of this. And in fact, talking about your feelings or other people's feelings was just not done. It was just, even though I interviewed people for a living for 20 years for Time Magazine and other places, I never got any training in how to do it, which is crazy, right? So I just did it intuitively. And I thought I was pretty good at it. And then, I remember going to my first tactical listening training, which I was just doing for a story. And I thought, it's just kind of silly, waste of time. I already know how to do this. And it took about 15 minutes for me to realize, actually, I was pretty bad at this and I could get better. So, it's not our fault. Like we should have been trained in this stuff. And I think, right, more and more residents are getting more training in this. Is that fair to say?
Yes, much more. And healthcare has done a good job, and medicine as a profession has done a better job of making this available. I will say the quote that I love about this is Alan Alda, the actor who played Hawkeye Pierce on MASH and has been in, any number of movies and is fantastic. I got the chance to do a course with him on medical communication. But in his book, If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face? He has this, which is a fantastic book about communication, but he has this quote. He says, the people talking have to listen harder than the people listening. And it's such a powerful quote because when you're talking, if you're not seeing what the reaction is, you're in an echo chamber.
Yeah. And it's really hard to do that, right? When you're being pulled in different ways. I mean, I think we have a thing where we teach people red flag words to listen for, so indicators that probably something else is going on and you should be curious about that, So if people use a metaphor where they feel like, I feel like I'm on a roller coaster, say, right? Like that suggests there's more there. Or they use a word that's like 20% stronger than you expected. Like, I felt sick to my stomach, when they're not talking about physical illness, right? And so those are little ways, again, with some training that you can your brain will just kind of glitch and you'll be like, wait, let's go back to that, and that's how you kind of dig underneath and see if you're understanding what's really going on with the person. And you can do it pretty quickly. I think that's one of the challenges when we train journalists is they think, oh, this is going to take too long. And I assume the doctors would have the same concern. But what we found is it's faster if you do the looping, the tactical listening once or twice, then the person feels like you're trying to get them. even if you're failing. And then they will start to tell you more and more revealing, nuanced things much more quickly than if you just kind of go down your checklist and, keep asking them new questions or focus on what's most interesting to you.
We could do a whole podcast on listening with you. It would be amazing, because I do actually think that we have a ton of training on how to conduct a medical interview. Obviously, it's part of the competence that we want all physicians to meet. But I think the nuance and the real practice is not something that maybe we're trained on as well. And that would be an interesting thing. I want to switch gears for the last little bit of this, because I do want to address this, which is this idea of status hierarchy and conflict, because I think that I communicated with you before, and I read this book by Will Storr, kind of The Status Game, and there's another book from a while back called Status Anxiety, and not by Will Storr, by another author, but status and the status hierarchy and where you sit plays into this conflict, I think. Is that fair? I mean,
Yeah. I was so glad you sent me that summary of that book. I had never heard of it, but I've ordered it because I do think, look, if you think about it, you can't be humiliated without status issues, right? Like, it's just impossible. Like, if you don't care about hierarchy or status or power, or, as Curtis Toller, who's a former gang leader, current violence interrupter in Chicago that I follow for the book, he said to me, he puts it so well, he said, anytime there's a better than and a less than, there's always room for war, right? And I think that's status, right? And there's different kinds of status, I think, as that author kind of lays out, and there's some kinds are fine, right? Or functioning kinds of inevitable. I mean, we're wired to some degree, right, to pursue status. But then there's other kinds that tend to lead to dysfunction. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely something there. And it's, you can't humiliate me if I don't already feel like I'm up on high, right? Like if I'm above you and you bring me down to your level, then that's when I feel humiliated, right? Or beneath you.
Yeah, no, it's really a fascinating aspect of this, because I think that, and I just want to mention this because I think that physicians in particular who are listening to this podcast, I think one of the themes that I have heard for a long time is that within healthcare, the concept of physician autonomy, this idea that physicians held this status in society that is built into the education, right? That this is a noble profession, that this is a calling. And I imagine it's the same for journalism. There's this kind of, we often need that as we pursue this very challenging career of trying to educate ourselves and help people and so on. And so with that comes the desire for status. And then I think all of us at some point experience that humiliation maybe, or that challenge to status that just puts us into defensive mode that we talked about in the beginning of the conversation. And so it's all wrapped in together that we can't, and it's not, I don't know that there's a solution at the moment necessarily, but to recognize and talk about it amongst the physician community so that we can understand how we can help ourselves, maybe, in the sense of being able to recognize when we're, because of maybe some status threats or the humiliation based on that status hierarchy, that maybe we are falling towards conflict and being able to pull ourselves out of that.
Yeah, and I think you're right to say there's not an obvious solution per se, but I do think that it's so funny because with news outlets, the public are, pundits, politicians, they're always complaining that reporters are just doing things for profit, right? Like they're just trying to get clicks, whatever. What they're actually trying to get is attention. It's much more about ego than it is about money. I mean, it's obviously about both, right? Particularly at the institutional level, like the people who run the place. But for reporters, it's about ego. It's about status. It's about feeling like you matter and that you're making a difference. And there's some slice of that's good, and there's a big slice of it that's not. And so that's the thing we run into most when we train newsrooms is, it's the conventions and the ego. Those are the two things. Like this is the way we've always done it. And this is the way that I feel like I matter in the world. Those are the obstacles just as much as the business model, which is also a big challenge in journalism and healthcare, right? But if we don't talk about it, there's no shot. Like we're just going to be manipulated and we're going to make big mistakes. And it's so easy. Like look at how Trump talks about the media. He demonizes the media all the time. And reporters, a lot of them feel humiliated by that, right? And I don't blame them, but you don't want to take the bait. It's not going to work to just get more righteous and then demean him. Like that's high conflict, right? It backfires. Like it just doesn't, as we keep seeing, that's not how you get change, at least not lasting change. So it's very tricky, but at least let's put it out there. And I can say we all have competing identities, right? And that's where I think we can chip away at the status problem, right? Is like, increasingly I have ego or status around, I try not to, but I do have some around good conflict, right? Like I'm trying not to be a conflict entrepreneur. So then if I get in a conflict with someone, I feel this extra level of like, crap, I got to find a way where we both can emerge from this feeling whole, And so that's also status in a way, right? It's also ego, but it's like counteracting the other kinds of status that are, floating around in my crazy brain. But so there are ways in which, you want to be known as a good colleague, right? Or a good neighbor or a good dad or whatever. And those things compete sometimes with those other identities in a really good way.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because I think that the professional identity piece in medicine, but I think in all professions is something we all wrestle with because we're trying to define it for ourselves. We're trying to define it relative to everybody else around us. And there's plenty of variation of what that professional identity is. Just take a random sample of journalists or a random sample of ENT surgeons, right? And vastly different kind of professional identities. There's some that are congruent, but everybody struggles with that. And I think all of us, pursue kind of what we think is going to be the best professional identity for us. And sometimes that's adopted. Sometimes that's earned. Sometimes that is, fought for. Sometimes it's just chosen. But however it's done, when there's that humiliation, when there's that conflict entrepreneur, when there's sometimes the reduction maybe of your professional identity into a binary, right? We actually experience this in medicine. I call it specialtyism, right? There's a lot of competition among physicians sometimes that, this person got this on their scores or this person got under a really competitive program or this, they're at the top of their game and so on and so forth. And, marketing in medicine has a little bit to do with that. But ultimately there's this risk of, othering your own colleague because you're falling into that high conflict state, because you're just saying, well, they're just I've been the recipient of that. Well, you're just whatever. And it's humiliating, right? It totally erodes your professional identity when somebody others you and, puts you into a lesser category.
Yeah. And like with journalists, you get that a lot in political rhetoric, right? Where the entire profession, all doctors are put in one category, and the public will, I'm sure, do this. Patients have like deep distrust sometimes for all physicians, regardless of that internal complexity, right? And it's like a collapse of your humanity, right? On some level, like it just feels, in fact, the more we talk about it, I do think it's possible that healthcare is even more set up for high conflict than journalism. But I don't know, maybe they're just neck and neck. It's a tie. I'm going to call it
a tie. They might be. Well, it's actually, I'm glad you brought that up. Professions, as we think of them, medicine, journalism, the law, police, emergency response. There's a public, how do I say this? There's a responsibility to the public that is embedded in the profession, right? In different ways, right? That for physicians, it is the ethics of providing care. For journalism, it is the ethics of truth, maybe. And forgive me if I'm making assumptions. For the law, it's the ethics of a fair trial. And in that, for our own professional identity, we hold on to that because it's like, we're going to do this. We got to do it right. And then somebody comes along and says, well, all doctors are this, or all journalists are this. And it absolutely sets up high conflict.
It's very tricky. I mean, I think for me, it's been really helpful to get some distance from the profession. I don't know if you feel this way, but the more kind of in it you are, like if you're, working 60 hours a week at a hospital, like it's very hard, maybe impossible to get to pull back and go to the balcony and see this. But once I stopped being on staff at magazines, I started to see more of this, and it gives you a certain amount of freedom, right? To kind of notice it, to not get hijacked by it as much. And it's really liberating, but that's not, most of us can't do that for different reasons. So it's very tricky when you're really in it. It's
risky. Well, it's hard. It's hard to take that risk. I think medicine actually has a lot of that right now, in the sense that we have a lot of folks. So I haven't told you, but I became a physician coach this year. And I'm sure the readers are tired of me saying that, but there's this growth of coaches, like life coaches, right? And broadly within, broadly across the world. But that position of being a coach is to help somebody kind of pull out of their space and be able to get that perspective. And we all need that at some point in our lives, right? It's hard. It's not, you got to have the finances for it and the time for it and so on and so forth. But it is hard because in medicine, one of the trends has been coaching to leave medicine, right? To be able to get out of the rat race and get out of that stressful environment, right? And I'm not criticizing anybody for it. I mean, this is, for some people, it is really the best choice for their well-being and so on. But you're right, because whatever form that takes, you've got to get that perspective, right? It is, whether it's in that single moment of conflict that you're having with somebody arguing about, what should happen for a patient or what should be done in this article. I mean, even in medicine, we have conflicts around how an article should be written or who should be the author.
Sure. There's that status, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And if you can't get that perspective, it's really challenging.
I know. We do conflict coaching for the same reason, but even like with writing, every book I've written, I've hired an outside editor. And each time I hire them sooner in the process because I need someone else to see this the way the reader's going to see it. Like, I don't know why we would do these things in isolation. Like, I think there is a lot of ego involved with, it's mine and I am the creator and I am the master. And it's like, no, you're not. Like, it's going to be better if you can find a partner to bounce ideas around. They can tell you when you're in your head, when you're, you're taking something personally or whatever. That is the beauty of collaboration, right? And it has to be the right person. I mean, obviously, but yeah, especially in conflict, we really can get tunnel vision.
I want to thank you very much. This has been phenomenal. It is great to see you and talk again.
Absolutely. I always love talking with you. And I love the analogies and the patterns and it's like parallel play, like we're in these different worlds, but there's a lot of similarities.
Anything you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, we covered a lot of ground. I guess the only thing I would say, is that we are living in a time of really unusual conflict. Like, this is not normal and it won't last forever. It is probably, at least from a political point of view, going to get worse before it gets better, just looking at the indicators that predict future political violence and conflict. But one thing is that we are starting to develop some immunities around it, right? If you'll forgive the analogy. Like, I think we are starting to become less vulnerable to being manipulated by conflict entrepreneurs in politics in particular, but maybe on social media, or maybe that's naive of me, but I notice it more and more. And particularly because we're facing a presidential election with the exact two candidates that we've seen before. We know what both are like in office and on the campaign trail. So it's just not as magnetic. Like, it's harder to get sucked in. And I'm hearing that from friends on the right and the left. So I don't know what that means. Again, it might be Pollyanna, but I do think over time, it's getting a little harder for more and more of us to to be baited into high conflict in the same way. So I think part of what we have to do is just get smarter about how we fight. And we have to do it really fast because the technology is not on our side, right? Like, we've designed a bunch of our institutions to cultivate high conflict on purpose. We could design them, and I think in some cases we have, to cultivate good conflict on purpose, because that's the only way to prevent high conflict, is to have good conflict first. Like, you got to have conflict, right? So you have to create the conditions for healthy conflict. And that's the only way. Even though we want to avoid it, that's the only real way. So I do think we're getting smarter. And I think, people like yourself are trying to help our professions and ourselves get smarter faster. So the more conversations we can have about this, the more we can share, vocabulary and tips and tricks and rituals for good conflict, then the better it's going to go. Because we have to catch up to the high conflict in industrial complex that we've created and create something else.
Thank you again so much. Appreciate all your insight.
Good to see you, John. Take good care. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again from Heidi. Elevate your practice with a free AI scribe, zero cost, HIPAA compliant, and time saving. Ready to swap? We've got you covered for past AI scribe expenses. Head to HeidiHealth.com, get started, and make your practice the envy of every stethoscope in town. Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee, and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.